The Scout is TF2's quintessential glass cannon, an archetype that's led to some of the most explosive, high-octane characters of all time. Powerful, yet frail. High risk, high reward. Scout is the fastest class in the game by a wide margin, armed with a scattergun that can kill 8 of the 9 mercs in just over 1 second. Yet to achieve that damage, you need to get close. Really close. Uncomfortably close, given that Scout also has the lowest health in the game. One missed shot and you're as good as dead. To use this class effectively, you need to make countless decisions within every second of every interaction. When to ambush and from what angle, when to step back and juke, when to use your double jump and in what direction, what nearby terrain to use to your advantage, when to retreat for health, and when to return for more. With his unmatched mobility, Scout is the one who decides when a fight with him starts. Yet his limitations allow any enemy to keep him at bay, whether that be by avoiding open areas, sticking with teammates, or simply landing a clean shot and forcing the Scout to retreat. Powerful, yet frail. High risk, high reward. TF2 Scout is one of the most well-balanced video game characters in history. Which was kind of an issue in itself, because Valve didn't stop development for TF2 after its release. So how did Valve go about changing a class that was already perfect? Well, they experimented. What if Scout was even stronger? What if he was even faster? What if he could triple jump or quadruple jump? What if he could have 100 more health? What if he could stun Hubert players? These are just some of the insane ideas for Scout that Valve toyed with throughout TF2's development, with most of them ultimately breaking the class's balance in their own unique way. There's a reason why Scout has consistently been the most requested class for this series. So, without further ado, this is the evolution of Scout. Upon TF2's release, Scout was a bit of an enigma to players at the time. TF2, as the 2 in the name would imply, was a follow-up to Team Fortress Classic. That game also had a Scout class, but Classic Scout was nothing more than a flag runner. He was the fastest class in the game, but also among the weakest. His main weapon was the nail gun, which players quickly learned to only use in self-defense due to how unreliable it was, much like the syringe gun for medic today. TF2 Scout is still the fastest class, and with his unique double capture rate, many assumed that this iteration was more of the same, a class that was only good for doing the objective. And this was almost the case. During TF2's development, Valve had originally planned for Scout to use his crappy nail gun yet again, as seen in a trailer released just 1 year before TF2's launch. Valve was aware of how unpopular the nail gun had been in Team Fortress Classic, and observed that most classic Scout players switched to the shotgun instead. So, at some point during TF2's final year in development, Valve said, "Screw it, let's just ditch the nail gun and make Scout's primary weapon a shotgun." Thus, the scattergun was born. The scattergun is mostly the same as the stock shotgun seen on other classes, but with one key difference. Its ramp-up maxes out at 175% instead of the usual 150, leading to point-blank shots, or meat shots, dealing 105 damage rather than 90. That's enough to kill Soldier, the second tankiest class in the game, with 2 shots, while leaving plenty of room for error against Pyros, Demos, and Medics. What was once the weakest class in Team Fortress Classic was now among the strongest. In theory. In practice, however, as it turned out, landing those meat shots was much easier said than done. If you got behind someone, then sure, landing that first meat shot wasn't difficult. But then that enemy would, react, and you'd suddenly be at risk at eating an equally powerful shot. And while the other combat classes can brush off 100 damage and keep fighting, that same damage to a Scout is near lethal. Scouts that play the class like they would Soldier, just walking forward and shooting enemies head on, will do nothing but die. Which is exactly what happened to those that attempted Scout following TF2's launch. Take a look at this data that Valve posted to Steam in December of 2007. Scouts at the time were the second worst killers in the game on average. So was TF2 Scout a repeat of Team Fortress Classic? No. Scout really was among the most powerful classes from the very start, but his potential could only be achieved in the hands of an experienced player. Take Scout's mobility for instance. To the average player, Scout's speed and double jump are only for getting from point A to point B. A skilled player knows how to abuse these options to the fullest during combat. They'll move from side to side, hide behind or jump on top of props, double jump with different timings and at different angles, all while keeping their crosshair locked onto you. They can use their speed to kite you, staying just outside of your effective range while dodging your attacks and peppering you with either scattergun or pistol shots. Putting all of these factors together, Scout was incredibly, possibly even overbearingly strong. In the right environment, and only with a considerable amount of skill. He thrived in low player count games and on wide open maps, and struggled in high player games on choky, spam-filled maps. If this was where Scout's limitations ended, he'd be a class that was arguably balanced, but very frustrating to fight against. Let your guard down for 1 second and a Scout can suddenly appear, hit you with a meat shot or two, and run away before anyone can land a solid hit on him. But there's one more thing I haven't mentioned. See, Scouts have a tendency to get countered by Engineer. Well, not him specifically. It's the Sentry. Sentries counter Scout. Hard. It is the hardest counter in the entire game. Scout's speed and evasiveness mean nothing against the Sentry's perfect aim, which is capable of killing a Scout in the blink of an eye. Doesn't matter how skilled the Scout is, he is not stepping within the Sentry's line of sight for more than a second. And this is necessary. There needs to be something to prevent the fastest class from having full control over every engagement. Something to let players catch their breath and not feel the need to be on high alert at all times. Yes, Scout already struggles on choky maps, but not every map is going to be as claustrophobic as Dust Bowl. With that being said, it is baffling just how hard Sentries counter Scout, which is ironic because the one thing that the old nailgun was good at was destroying buildings. When Scout is facing a Sentry, there's nothing he can do unless the Sentry's out in the open and the Engineer is already dead. If that's the case, you can slowly chip away at it with your pistol or corner peek it with your scattergun, hoping that no one else on the enemy team spots you and kills you immediately. The fact that all buildings take base damage and aren't affected by ramp up is especially bad news for Scout, because it means even a point-blank scattergun shot will only deal 60 damage maximum. Making matters worse, Sentries are most prevalent on the choky maps that Scout already struggles on. And where are Sentries usually placed? Right behind the front line, behind where all the action is, where Scout is supposed to do his job by flanking and picking enemies off. Scout players had to accept that there'd be times when they couldn't do anything, which only further exacerbated the class's steep learning curve. How are you supposed to practice under those conditions? Well, there was one way. Following TF2's launch, there was a small but growing community of players that also wished to play the game at a faster pace, free from choke points and sentry spam. These players would eventually create what's known today as Sixes, TF2's very first competitive format. Sixes is not simply TF2 with skilled players. Through class limits, smaller team sizes, and the exclusion of choky maps, Sixes is an alternate version of TF2 that downplays its intended focus on slow team pushes and instead puts a heavy emphasis on deathmatching skill, which, as you can imagine, was perfect for the fast DM class. Yet, despite Sixes being tailor-made to suit Scout's strengths and minimize his weaknesses, the class was not a dominant force from the start. Don't get me wrong, Scout was obviously very strong, otherwise he wouldn't be used on practically every team. But Scouts at the time played more of a support role because players had not yet developed the skills to carry their team on their own. It wouldn't be until 2009, well over a year after TF2's launch, that competitive players finally began to unlock Scout's full potential. This is Carnage, arguably the most influential Scout player of all time. Whereas most Scout players played passively, it was Carnage who proved that, with enough skill, an aggressive Scout was capable of wiping teams single-handedly. This may not sound surprising today, but at the time, it was groundbreaking, and other Scouts were quick to follow suit. By the way, the term meat shot had been popularized because of Carnage, who used it as a chat bind to tilt the other team. Yes, the most influential Scout player of all time used annoying chat binds. I'm not making this up. The rise of Carnage served to illustrate just how absurdly steep Scout's learning curve was. It took the best players over a year to learn that Scouts could kill one enemy after another on his own, after spending all of that time in a format that was designed to be non-stop DMing. Meanwhile, Scout mains in pubs had been spending most of their playtime banging their head against a wall, waiting for that one sentry to go down. This class was already bound to look very different in the hands of skilled players, but the nature of pubs and sixes increased the gap between the average and top players tenfold. In any case, by 2009, it was clear that TF2 Scout was not a repeat of Team Fortress Classic. This iteration of Scout was a killing machine, but only when used by those with solid game sense and pinpoint accuracy. For those that played competitive, investing time into learning Scout was a no-brainer. For those that played in pubs, however, motivation to play Scout was lacking, to say the least. Looking back at Valve's data from 2007, Scout was initially the most played class in the game. Yet 1 year later, Scout's usage would plummet from 1st all the way down to 8th. And who would usurp Scout as the #1 pick? Why, Engineer, of course. And what was the most popular map at the time? Dust Bowl, followed by Two Fort and Gold Rush. In December of 2008, Valve announced via a blog post that Scout would be the next class to receive his own update, with their main goal being to make the class more useful on those choky maps. If one were to look at Valve's own data, it'd be easy to assume that Scout was too weak, but Valve was aware that this wasn't the case. In fact, it was Valve who had to clarify to IGN following a pre-launch play session that a good Scout, quote, kills the crap out of people. They knew that the class was strong in the hands of an experienced player, but the vast majority of players were nowhere close to that level. They also knew that no matter how skilled a Scout player was, they were near useless in the average pub match. So any unlocks Valve had in store for Scout would ideally make him easier to use and give him more opportunities to get in, without making him any better at killing once he did make it in. Not an easy task, as Valve themselves would lament. After months of development, the Scout update would be released to the public on February 24th, 2009, bringing with it 3 new unlockable weapons. Let's start with the simplest of the 3, the Bonk Atomic Punch. This was the unlock that everyone knew was coming. Everyone knew that Scout was going to get some anti-sentry weapon. The question was, what would such a weapon look like? Well, Bonk wasn't a weapon per se, but a tool. Consuming it would grant you temporary invincibility, during which time you wouldn't be able to attack. Scouts using Bonk were still helpless against sentries, but now they could brute force their way into the flank that the sentry would have otherwise denied them from. Ditto for spam-filled choke points. Just drink Bonk, hold W, and once Bonk wore off, you'd be in every Scout's dream scenario, behind the enemy team and away from spam and sentries. This may sound like an absurdly broken tool to give Scout, but there were a few things that kept it in check. First, if you were using Bonk to get past a choke or sentry nest, then even once you got behind the enemy team, they were still at that choke or nest. Instead, Scouts in this situation would run all the way back to the enemy spawn to destroy any teleporters, then hound enemies on their long walk out of spawn. The fact that respawn times in TF2 happen in waves meant that Bonk Scouts wouldn't be fed a constant stream of 1v1 fights that they'd excel in. And even in the event that a lone enemy was ambushed, the Scout's loss of his pistol meant that he'd have to work harder to get the kill with the scattergun alone. If a Scout managed to slip behind the enemy undetected, they could even wait on the final point for a backcap. But all of this, of course, was assuming that the Scout made it past the enemy in the first place. Bonk may grant invincibility from damage, but not knockback. Air Blast, explosives, and especially sentries could pin a scout against the wall or skybox, leading to his demise once bonk wore off. The effect only lasted for 6 seconds, and once that was up, scouts would suffer from a 6-second cooldown where they'd run at half their normal speed, only slightly faster than soldier. Even if you made it past that choke or sentry, if you encountered any enemy during that 6-second cooldown, you were as good as dead. So bonk gave Scout the opportunity to get into an ideal position no matter the map, but only if the enemy team allowed it. Bonk also enabled Scouts to take down sentries, though not on his own. Rather than running past a sentry, bonk Scouts could instead stand in front of one, distracting it while a teammate ran in to destroy it. Or you could position yourself between the sentry and the engineer to kill him with his own sentry. On paper, bonk was exactly what Scout needed. In practice, it was a bit undercooked, which was perfectly fine. In fact, it's a good sign that Valve was erring on the side of caution. All it'd take was a few tweaks later down the line for bonk to become an excellent addition to Scout's kit. The Force of Nature, or FAN, was the end result of Valve's reportedly large number of potential new primaries. Upon its release, it largely functioned the same as it does today. It held 2 shots in its clip, which fired 50% faster than stock and packed 20% more pellets, but dealt 20% less damage. Each shot would deal up to 101 damage at point blank, and although that combined with the fan's faster firing speed could have allowed it to be even better at killing than stock, its potential burst damage was neutered by the fan's knockback. Any shot from the fan would launch enemies away from you, meaning subsequent shots would suffer from both falloff and bullet spread. And after firing both shots, Scouts would need to wait nearly 1.5 seconds for the fan to reload, giving enemies more than enough time and distance to escape. Sounds counterproductive, doesn't it? It was, but that was the point. The knockback ensured that skilled scouts wouldn't have full control over every engagement like they could with stock. They could still use their speed to decide when a fight starts, but they'd also be ending said fight as soon as they landed their first shot. Or at least, that was the idea. Despite Valve's efforts to make a primary that wasn't busted in skilled hands, the original fan had the potential to do just that. First, there was a technique that would later be dubbed force jumping. By firing at the ground while mid-air, scouts could knock themselves upwards, effectively giving them a triple jump. This was totally fine, and added a much-needed layer of depth to a weapon that was otherwise limited in combat. The fan's extra jump opened up new flanking and ambushing opportunities, though how useful this was varied from map to map. What made the fan potentially devastating was how its knockback differed from today. Originally, it launched enemies at a flat rate. Didn't matter whether you dealt 1 damage or 100, at point blank or from across the map. All it took into account was the enemy's momentum. The fan's knockback also didn't launch enemies very far at all. So if you hit someone with a point blank shot and kept running forwards, you'd be set up for a second point blank shot before they landed. And that second shot would also apply knockback, even if they were still mid-air, launching them further into the air. If 2 shots weren't enough to kill them, you could get in some easy pistol shots. And if that wasn't enough, they would almost certainly die to fall damage. It was like the old air blast flare gun combo, except the air blast also dealt damage, and the flare gun was also air blast, all coming from the class that could appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Was the fan overpowered? No, at least not at the time. Pulling off those 1-2 fan combos required precise aim, something that most scouts still lacked. They stuck to using the hit-and-run tactics that the weapon had originally been designed for. Even in the hands of a hypothetical perfect player, the fan would still lose out to the scattergun over the course of a match due to its smaller clip size and slow reload. But while the fan may have gotten less kills overall, each of those kills were much easier to get, to the frustration of its victims. This, as we'll find, is going to be a common trend with many of Scout's unlocks. If a good fan scout wanted to kill you, there was very little you could do once he landed that first shot. Speaking of easy kills, that leads me into the final unlock from this update, the Sandman. The Sandman should need no introduction. Anyone who knows anything about TF2's history knows that the original Sandman was one of, if not the most absurdly overpowered weapons of all time. Its stats were simple. In exchange for your double jump being disabled, you'd be granted a bat that knocked out a mean stun ball. Losing your double jump was a massive downside. Although, if you found yourself on a choke point or sentry-infested map, you weren't going to be double jumping very often anyways. Or if you were a newer scout that didn't know how to use double jumping mid-combat. For those that only double jumped to get around the map, they could even use the fan to regain some of that mobility. The Sandman's downside was extreme, but that was the point. It ensured that whatever upside they gave to the Sandman, it'd only be worth using in the situations where Scout struggled, and not where he was already strong enough. However, the upside that Valve gave to the Sandman was, just a smidge too good. Swinging the Sandman also launched a ball that, upon hitting an enemy, would completely stun them. As in, they couldn't attack or even move. The length of the stun varied depending on how far the Sandman ball had traveled, up to a maximum of 7 seconds with a long-range moonshot. But hitting someone at close range still gave a scout more than enough time to run in and kill them. At max range, scouts even had enough time to run up and kill someone with the Sandman's taunt kill. The cooldown for the ball was 15 seconds, which was already short for such a powerful effect, but scouts could pick the ball back up to regain it instantly. So you could stun someone, kill them, then pick the ball back up since it wouldn't have gone too far. The Sandman made the 1v1 class even better at beating anyone 1v1. You wouldn't be missing your double jump versus a stunned enemy, because there weren't any attacks to dodge. In particular, the Sandman ruined what had otherwise been a strong check to scouts: heavy. As a scout, you could not take on a heavy that was revved up and aware of your presence. You'd just get torn to shreds, no different than with sentries. But unlike sentries, heavies don't auto-lock onto enemies. Since the minigun is an automatic weapon that requires tracking, heavies have a hard time keeping their crosshair on enemies that are right in front of them. To beat a revved up heavy as scout, you'd need to take a gamble and run in while he was distracted, then blast him over and over while jumping like a madman. This took a considerable amount of skill on the scout's part, and was only possible because the heavy had let his guard down. Now enter the Sandman. Even if a heavy is revved up and actively fighting you, you'd stun him and kill him in 3 shots. There was nothing he could do about it. What if you were using the fan? The stun might end before it could reload and get off that 3rd shot, right? Well, the Sandman's stun also unrevved Heavy's minigun, so even once it wore off, Heavies would need to rev up all over again. And I haven't even gotten to the worst part. The original Sandman could stun Ubered players. That sounds like an oversight, but no. The Sandman stunning Ubers was completely intentional, and even mentioned in the weapons update page. If you managed to stun the medic, you'd force him to stop healing his pocket, meaning they'd lose their Uber and get obliterated. The Sandman was unlike anything the game had seen before. There had been some questionable balance decisions already, but the Sandman was in a league of its own. Or should I say, the Sandman wasn't in any league, because it would make history by becoming the first ever unlock to be banned in all major competitive leagues at the time. CEVO banned it within a week, and ETF2L would follow suit a week after that. Hatred of the Sandman wasn't exclusive to competitive players either. No one liked being forced to spectate their own death in real time, all because they got hit by a single projectile. Stuns don't belong in an FPS, especially not one that was so deliberately designed to make every interaction feel fair. Most of the time, at least. This was a widely shared belief, even as far back as 2009. People were not happy about the Sandman, and it didn't take long for Valve to get the memo. On March 13th, the Sandman would be given 2 nerfs. First, a minimum distance for stuns was added, which was just beyond point-blank range. This accomplished nothing. If a scout was too close to stun you, you wouldn't be able to stop him from running 5 feet backwards unless you were also a scout. Second, players that were stunned would now have a 50% damage resistance to all sources. This was a rushed band-aid fix, plain and simple. the Sandman was still about as frustrating to fight as it was before, and its most egregious aspect, stunning Ubers, was left untouched. Even if they increased the resistance, even if you took 0 damage while stunned, the fact that the Sandman could revoke your ability to play the game was enough reason to hate it. And keep in mind that alongside the Sandman, there was still the Force of Nature, which was effectively a stun lock itself. Only a handful of players had begun to unlock the weapon's potential, but their numbers were growing. So you can imagine their delight when, on June 8th, the fan's damage penalty was lowered from -20% to -10%. Now, a meat shot with the fan would deal up to 113 damage, even more than the scattergun. For those that only used hit-and-run tactics, this was a necessary buff. But for the players who were skilled enough to juggle enemies in the air, this may have been a bit too much. Remember, the fan's knockback was hit scan, infinite range, and only required you to hit a single pellet. All it took to guarantee a kill on any light class was a 12 damage chip shot from medium range. You'd have enough time to react and run in for a meat shot before they landed from their predictable path. Killing a medic in this way only required 37 damage, which could also be done from medium range. Again, I must emphasize that the vast majority of players were not yet capable of using the fan like this, but the potential was there. By August, it was clear that both the Force of Nature and Sandman were in need of some major changes. Both weapons were devastating when used by skilled players, and extremely annoying when used by everyone else. They'd be nerfed in the classless update of August 13th. But before we get into those weapons, let's first talk about the pistol. When TF2 first launched, the pistol's fire rate could be increased by clicking rapidly rather than holding the button down. It was a cute bit of realism that players, of course, immediately took advantage of. Whether it was through scripts or mouse wheel binds, players could easily achieve the pistol's max fire rate without actually needing to click more than once, which made the pistol much more lethal than it was intended to be. The classless update fixed this. Now, it'd fire at a fixed rate, which, thankfully, was the perfect amount. Moving on to the Force of Nature, its knockback was changed to only work in close range. The knockback itself would also no longer be a flat rate. Instead, it would scale with how much damage was dealt, though ultimately the knockback was still comparable to how it was before. Scouts could no longer juggle enemies in the air either, as now, only the first shot would apply any knockback. All of these changes were perfect. They prevented skilled scouts from winning fights off of a single mid-range chip shot and juggling people in the air until they died, while noobs spamming shots from across the map were now much less irritating. The final change made to the fan was a bug fix. The angle of its self knockback would now vary depending on which direction you were aiming in. Before, the fan would always launch you into the air, even if you were aiming straight up. Yeah, this thing had some Looney Tunes-ass physics. As a consequence of this change, however, force jumping off the ground at a 45-degree angle would now factor in your forward momentum and launch you up significantly higher than before. This was likely unintended, but people loved it, and so it stayed. Though, wait, if force jumping was just made better, didn't that make it even easier to downplay the Sandman's sole downside? About that. See, the Sandman also received some big changes in this update, one of which was removing its no double jump downside. In exchange, it would instead reduce the wearer's health by 30. Scouts using the Sandman now maxed out at just 95 health. This was definitely the right idea. Part of what made the original Sandman so frustrating was how the lack of double jumping wasn't a big deal to scouts that didn't know how to play the class. They were essentially getting free kills for no downside, which made dying to the Sandman even more infuriating. The nerfs for the Sandman didn't stop there either. Stunned heavies would no longer be forcibly unrevved, and Ubers were finally made immune to the stun altogether. This was also the update that gave the Sandman an alt fire for its stun ball, letting you swing the bat itself without also launching the ball. Not a huge deal, but weird that it wasn't like that from the start. The last change to the Sandman was a buff, actually. Stunned players would now only resist 25% of damage taken, down from 50%. Alright, so putting everything together, the Sandman was now garbage, yet still overpowered? 95 health on Scout was atrocious. you'd die to a single grenade, rocket, meat shot, and so on. But like with the loss of the double jump, your health doesn't matter when a stunned enemy can't attack you. The Sandman was still just as frustrating to die to, yet now it's also more frustrating to use. Either the scout dies in one hit, or he kills you for free. A projectile that stunned you was a bad idea, and Valve would be better off scrapping it altogether. In the end, the Force of Nature, Sandman, and even the pistol were nerfed. These changes were all necessary, but by now, all 3 of Scout's new unlocks were either underwhelming or unreliable. Don't feel too bad for Scout mains though, because after the nerfs were said and done, the classless update also bestowed the class with one massive gift: the introduction of King of the Hill. It's hard to believe that such a simple game mode wasn't part of the base game. It's even harder to believe that Payload was added an entire year before King of the Hill. The new game mode came with 3 maps: Viaduct, Nucleus, and Sawmill, and the rules were about what you would expect. Whichever team holds the center point for 3 total minutes wins. What made King of the Hill unique was how short each individual match was. Because of this, the maps here were much more open to allow for non-stop action, which was perfect for scouts and terrible for engineers, who still couldn't even move buildings. Finally, a game mode where scouts could really hone their skills. Would scouts end up dominating King of the Hill to the point of making every other class inferior? Don't worry, there'd be something later down the line to keep them in check. For now, let them have their fun. The final balance change of the year came in December, and it was yet another reworking of the Sandman. As of this update, the Sandman would now only fully stun players with its max range moonshot, which, for reference, was about the distance between the 2 fort battlements. All other hits would instead put enemies in a fleeing state, like when your team loses the round. In this state, you still couldn't attack or jump, but you could move, albeit with a 10% speed penalty. With this new animation, stuns would now end instantly rather than needing to waste an extra second shaking it off like before, meaning close-range Sandman stuns no longer granted enough time to kill enemies from full health. Lastly, the damage penalty for stunned enemies was removed entirely, now that they could actually move and dodge attacks. This was, at the very least, preferable over the old stun. But it's still a stun. You can wiggle around now, sure, but you still have no way of actually fighting back. All you can do is hope that the scout misses. Meanwhile, for those that were using the Sandman, the health penalty was even more crippling than before, now that stunned enemies could dodge your attacks and one-shot you the moment the stun ended. This version of the Sandman was hot garbage, but still too good at the same time? I don't even know at this point. It was just dumb. Let's leave it at that. By the end of 2009, Valve was already seeing how difficult this class was to balance. Scout's very nature as a glass cannon meant there would always be a massive difference between the average player and the few that were able to surpass Scout's learning curve. Scout's speed also meant players could push any weapon's advantages and minimize its weak points much more than with any other class. Like with the Sandman. If you missed the stun, you'd be at a major disadvantage in any fight. But being a scout, you could just choose not to fight that person, run away, and try again 15 seconds later. Or with the original Force of Nature, scouts had more than enough time to react to the knockback of the first shot and run in for a meat shot. You give this class an inch, he'll take a mile. The silver lining was that stock scout was basically perfect right out of the gate. Valve had all the time in the world to experiment, and surely, by the end of TF2's development, Scout will have a wide array of fun and balanced options to use. "2010 picked up immediately where the previous year left off, with more reworks for Scout's unlocks. On January 6th, the Sandman's health penalty was cut in half, going from -30 health to -15. Now, Sandman Scouts would have 110 health. That might still sound crippling, but this change made a world of difference. Scouts would no longer be one-shot by grenades or opposing meat shots, while rockets only one-shot at point-blank range. which scouts could choose to avoid when fighting soldiers. That's not to say the health penalty wasn't significant, because it was. Even if you managed to survive one hit, a light breeze was all it'd take to finish you off. Either way, this was a huge buff to the Sandman. The Force of Nature, meanwhile, received some minor changes following its reworking from the previous year. The classless update had made the fan's knockback only work at close range. This update made it work only at close range and only if your shots dealt at least 30 damage. The angle of the fan's knockback would also now depend on the angle you fired it at. This didn't make a huge difference. It really only served to fix the aforementioned Looney Tunes-ass physics, since some shots just didn't look right. Lastly, the fan's knockback was changed to have less of an effect on grounded enemies. And by less, I mean it didn't knock back enemies at all. Which, wasn't that the whole point of using the fan? I have no idea what Valve's plan was here, and apparently neither did they. 1 week later, the fan's knockback would fully affect grounded enemies once again, with the minimum damage required being raised to 40. We're still not done though, because in the midst of all these bug fixes and changes and revisions, someone at Valve must have messed up the fan's code. Its knockback still only worked at close range on 40 plus damage shots, and its new angling was working just fine. But as for the knockback strength, what the hell is this? Remember, from the fan's release up until this update, its knockback at full strength was comparable to Air Blast. Now, almost a year later, it was suddenly launching people across the map. There's no way this was intentional, since there was no mention of it in the patch notes. But, like the unintentionally improved force jumping, players loved this new knockback. And so it stayed, giving us the Force of Nature that we know today. Now, this new knockback was technically a huge nerf, since it made it even harder to kill enemies with that second shot. But who cares? It's fun. This new fan made Scout, whose character was purposefully designed to be annoying, even more annoying. Those that wanted to be as obnoxious as possible would don gaudy lime green cosmetics, equip the fan, and do nothing but blasting people across the map while spamming chat binds. Which was so effective at pissing people off that the community essentially invented a slur specifically for this type of player, the Scout. The Force of Nature was and still is a great side grade, which is a miracle considering its messy balance history. January 13th also saw the death of Crazy Legs, a bug that had persisted for years, where the legs of a double jumping Scout would look like they were, quote, made of raw bacon strips held up in a wind tunnel. Sometimes you can still get a glimpse of old Crazy Legs today, but it's nowhere near as ridiculous as it once was. Skipping ahead to April, Scout would be given a new unlock out of nowhere, the Criticola. According to Robin Walker, the Criticola had been designed the day before it was released, which to him was supposedly terrifying. Oh boy, so how broken was it? Well, the Criticola was another consumable secondary like Bonk, except instead of granting invulnerability, the Criticola would grant 6 seconds of guaranteed mini-crits. Giving Scout on-demand mini-crits was potentially game-breaking. Mini-crits, like full criticals, aren't affected by damage falloff, meaning Scouts could deal solid damage without needing to get close. And unlike crits, mini-crits are still affected by ramp-up, so a mini-crit boosted meat shot dealt just over 140 damage, more than enough to one-shot any light class. Thankfully, the original Criticola was balanced by the fact that consuming it would also mark the Scout for death, making him take mini-crits as well as dish them out. If anything, the Criticola was actually pretty underpowered, and not just because it took skill to use effectively. Scout's health is usually just enough to survive one clean shot, but when marked for death, that one shot was suddenly lethal, even if the Scout kept his distance. Like with Bonk, Valve was erring on the side of caution here, which makes sense considering that they only gave themselves a single day to design this thing. Speaking of Bonk, it was changed in the same update to match the Criticola's 30-second cooldown upon consumption. Its old downside of slowing you down post-invulnerability was also removed entirely. Wow, I mean, Bonk did need some sort of buff, but that sounds a bit extreme, no? Well, following Bonk's release, players had discovered that they could entirely bypass the slowdown by mashing their strafe keys, which is likely what led to Valve dropping the downside entirely. This didn't break the weapon per se, but it did make using Bonk pretty brainless, since it'd be next to impossible for anyone other than opposing scouts to chase you down. In any case, Bonk was now a reliable, albeit situational, tool in Scout's arsenal. The Sandman was also given yet another buff. Stunned players would now have a greater speed reduction, making them much easier to hit. Okay, seriously, what is going on here? It's been nerfs, then buffs, then nerfs, then buffs for this thing from the moment it was released. Valve clearly wasn't happy with the Sandman, and in fact, Robin Walker would say exactly that in an interview with PC Gamer later this year. Their frustration was self-inflicted. Of course it was hard trying to balance a stun-inducing projectile in an FPS, so why was Valve so hesitant to let the mechanic go? Well, immediately after expressing his disappointment with the Sandman, Walker went on to explain Valve's interest in running elaborate experiments in order to hone their game design skills. Like, what if everyone had 10 health, or 10 times as much health? Oh, so it was an experiment. The Sandman was an experiment. Can you balance an unlock with such an extreme upside? According to Robin Walker, they now had their answer. No. Quote, "We're still not super happy with the Sandman, but we might just call done on it. Lesson learned and move on." Oh good, Valve was finally ready to drop the stun mechanic and think of something else for the Sandman to do. Huh? What do you mean the Sandman won't be changed for another 7 years? They just left it like that? Now, if you had to balance the Sandman without removing its stun, this final version was far from the worst you could do. The health penalty was significant, but not debilitating. The stun still disarmed enemies, but they could move around and be somewhat hard to hit. Landing a Sandman shot on someone at close range only stunned them for a second, hardly enough time to switch to the scattergun and get more than one free shot off. More range meant more potential stun time, but also more time for an enemy to dodge the ball. It basically forced an ambush situation onto enemies even if they were aware of you. You got one free shot on them, but then they had the chance to counterattack. The Sandman wasn't overpowered so much as it was lame. If a scout stunned you, all you could do was wiggle WASD and hope that he missed. Boy, doesn't that sound familiar. Yes, you can dodge the ball, but then any smart scout can see that he's missed and run away if he thinks he'd be at a disadvantage. You can't stop a scout from running away, and when he stuns you, you can't do much of anything. No one likes being put at such a massive disadvantage from something that requires zero commitment. Plus, I've only been talking about 1v1 fights. That's where the Sandman shined, but during those slow moments where a scout couldn't do much, why not chuck a random Sandman ball out? Most of the time it wouldn't hit anyone, but on the rare occasion that you were fully stunned by a scout from across the map, that was infuriating. Yet, this version of the Sandman was here to stay, despite Valve themselves acknowledging that it was far from perfect. At the very least, Valve had tweaked it to the point that fully abusing the Sandman's capabilities took some amount of skill. But what if you found yourself against a skilled scout who was wiping the floor with your team? Was there anything you could do about it? As it turned out, yes. By 2010, there were a few ways to keep those pesky scouts at bay. First, the Natasha. Released in the Heavy Update of 2008, the Natasha slowed down anyone who was hit by it. This was a death sentence for Scout, who was specifically called out on the Natasha's update page. Next, the Direct Hit, which was released with the War Update of 2009. Its 25% damage bonus lets it one-shot light classes at close range, which, of course, is the range Scouts need to be at to land meat shots. Then there's Engineer. Sentries have always been a massive thorn in the sides of Scout mains everywhere. But once a teammate took the sentry down, Scouts would be free to terrorize the enemy until they could get another sentry up. Engineers couldn't move their buildings either, so on certain maps and game modes, spending the time to build a level 3 sentry wasn't worth it. Then, in July of 2010, the Engineer update would drop, bringing with it the bane of every Scout main's existence, The Mini Sentry. It's a sentry that's smaller, cheaper, and faster, allowing them to thrive on the wide open maps that scouts usually preferred, especially King of the Hill. Scouts are pretty much helpless against minis, unlike the Natasha and Direct Hit, which require aim and allow a skilled scout to still come out on top. The Engineer update also allowed engineers to move their buildings, making leveled sentries a more common sight on 5CP, another game mode that scouts preferred. From 2011 to 2014, there would also be the Lock and Load, which gave demos a roughly 50-50 chance to one-shot scouts on servers with random damage spread enabled, such as Valve servers. Keep this in mind throughout the rest of the video. Scout, even at his most powerful, would never be truly unstoppable. With enough careless buffs, however, he could be extremely volatile, unstoppable in some situations and worthless in others. This was the tightrope one had to walk when balancing any glass cannon character. Every new unlock came with a new opportunity to break this careful balance. That is, so long as Scout remained a glass cannon. But what if he wasn't? Valve couldn't take away Scout's speed. That was his whole identity. But what if the class used that speed for support rather than DMing? Well, in the Manconomy update of September, Valve would proceed to test exactly that in their next experiment for Scout. Say hello to the Special Delivery Set. With 3 new unlocks and a hat, this set granted scouts an additional 25 health, leading to a base 150 health that could be increased to 225 with overheal, 100 more health than a normal scout. I shouldn't need to tell you that giving Scout more health had the potential to break the class, but the only way to find out for sure is to look at the unlocks themselves. Alright, let's see. Another drink unlock? That's clearly a secondary. Then, a wimpy looking pepper gun? That's gotta be a replacement for the pistol, right? So how do you use the milk and this pepper gun at the same time? There was some confusion before the update was available to play, but as it turned out, that pepper gun was actually Scout's new primary, the shortstop. Valve made no attempt to hide the fact that this was a pistol in the primary slot. It uses the pistol's taunt. It can be used to get achievements that require the pistol, and at the time, it even drew from the same reserve ammo as the pistol if you had both equipped. This was a pistol, and some were quick to dismiss it. But make no mistake, the original shortstop was powerful in the right hands. Compared to the scattergun, the shortstop only held 4 shots in its clip, with each shot having 60% fewer pellets and each pellet dealing a bit more damage. A meat shot, if you could even call it that, only dealt around 70 damage, as the shortstop also lacked the scattergun's increased damage ramp up. But fewer pellets also meant bullet spread was less of an issue, meaning the shortstop could still put out respectable damage at medium range. The shortstop also reloaded its entire clip at once, like the pistol. And like the pistol, the shortstop had incredibly fast firing and reload speeds, taking 1/3 of a second between shots and just 1 second to reload the entire clip. Putting everything together, the shortstop was able to dish out constant damage even at mid-range, which was huge for those that knew to kite enemies and dodge their attacks. The shortstop was also supposed to have a slowdown effect on hits, like the Natasha, but it never actually worked, leading to Valve ditching it entirely by December. Which is hilarious because that's where the shortstop got its name from. It was supposed to stop you for a short time. Yet, even without its intended upside, the original shortstop was no slouch. The Mad Milk was a new secondary that, when thrown, would cover all enemies within a massive radius with milk. Once enemies were coated in milk, 75% of any damage dealt to them would be returned as health. This was an incredibly powerful support tool. It could easily turn the tides of any team fight, just for tossing a projectile at the enemy's general direction. Milk would remain on enemies for 10 whole seconds, though that could be lowered to 2.5 seconds through healing from medics, dispensers, or the payload cart. The Mad Milk support capabilities didn't end there, however. It could also be used to extinguish yourself or your teammates. It also let scouts chase down dead ringer spies, who were otherwise incredibly hard to pin down. The Mad Milk's cooldown was only 20 seconds, so you weren't losing much by using it whenever the opportunity came up. Mad Milk was also a powerful tool for scouts who had no intentions of supporting their team. Just as it could be used to win a team fight, Mad Milk could also be used to give scouts a massive advantage in 1v1s. A full damage meat shot would heal nearly 80 health, allowing scouts to tank obscene amounts of damage. Using Mad Milk in this way took skill, of course. The majority of players were not capable of abusing Mad Milk to the fullest, but those that could proved that the unlock was a bit too powerful. The last weapon of the set was the Holy Mackerel, which functioned the same as it does today. It's the stock bat, but hitting someone with it would humiliate them by announcing every hit in the kill feed. Killing someone with the Holy Mackerel would be exclaimed as a fish kill. It also has funny jiggle physics. This was clearly a joke weapon, and a great one at that. People loved it when it first released, and people still love it today. So, circling back to the special delivery set as a whole, was it too good? Not really, but the health bonus was completely unnecessary. The Shortstop and Mad Milk were both a bit overtuned, and they already paired well together even without the set bonus. Though, the fact that Valve managed to give scouts extra health without completely breaking the class was an accomplishment in itself. Scout would receive 2 final unlocks for the year in the Australian Christmas update of December, the Candy Cane and the Boston Basher. The Candy Cane released with the same stats that it has today. Killing anyone while this weapon is equipped spawns a small health kit in their place. In exchange, equipping the Candy Cane also gives its user a 25% explosive damage vulnerability at all times. It's a straight upgrade in matches where the enemy team doesn't have a soldier or demo, but that's basically never. A 25% vulnerability means you're getting one-shot by grenades and close-range rockets. Against other classes, yes, the Candy Cane doesn't have any downsides, but a small health kit only heals 26 health. It's a high-risk, low-reward weapon. The best use case for the Candy Cane is when fighting pyros. You can kill any pyro with 2 meat shots and immediately heal off whatever damage they dealt to you afterwards. This was extra useful back in 2010, as getting hit by even a single flame particle dealt 10 seconds of afterburn. The Candy Cane is also useful as a training tool, since it forces you to get good at dodging explosives. Lastly, scouts can use the Candy Cane to spawn a health kit for their teammates. By, kill binding. Not very practical, I know, but I'm genuinely surprised I don't see more people doing this, if only for how funny the concept of killing yourself to heal someone is. The Boston Basher, like the Candy Cane, also released with the same stats that it has today. Hit someone and they bleed for 5 seconds. Miss and you hit yourself, idiot. When accounting for the bleed, a single hit with the Boston Basher deals up to 75 damage, while hitting yourself deals 58 total self-damage. It's a risky choice when used offensively, one that usually isn't worth going for. Ironically, when people use the Boston Basher, 9 times out of 10, it's because of the self-damage. It's far and away the best way to build Uber, since it doesn't knock you all over the place like explosives, nor does it make you empty your clip and leave you as a sitting duck should someone interrupt you. Swinging the Boston Basher right after jumping also causes self-knockback, making you go significantly higher. Every self-hit resets the 5-second bleed timer rather than stacking it, so from full health you can swing 3 times and still survive. Like with force jumping, Basher jumping opens countless new opportunities for quickly navigating the map and surprising enemies with flank routes that they wouldn't expect a scout to come out of. The self-damage could also easily be mitigated by taking paths with nearby health packs, immediately stopping the bleed and healing you back to full. All this for a replacement to the stock bat. Force jumping is cool and all, but it's held back by being attached to the fan. The Boston Basher was and still is an excellent unlock, despite its best feature being listed as a downside. Another year, another batch of balance changes and unlocks. The Sandman was still Scout's most controversial weapon by far, but this year also gave us the Shortstop and Mad Milk, weapons that were nowhere near as hated, but still very much overtuned. Though, that's a pretty good track record, especially since the Shortstop and Mad Milk's issues are only so glaring to us now in hindsight. To most players at the time, these weapons were seen as annoying at worst. On the other hand, the Force of Nature was now a perfectly fun side grade, and the Boston Basher allowed for limitless creativity. The advent of the Special Delivery set also opened the door for an entirely new subclass, a Scout that played more support than offense. So far, Valve's been doing a great job keeping Scout's extremes in check. He's fast, but not too fast. Strong, but not too strong. But don't worry, I know what you're here for. You've probably heard that Scout has had more overpowered unlocks than any other class in TF2's history. And that's correct. Scout has in fact had more overpowered unlocks than anyone else. What you probably haven't heard is that all of those unlocks were broken at the same time, with many being equipable with other broken unlocks on the same loadout. The Sandman was only the start to Valve's experiments with Scout. "2011 begins on a suspiciously low note with back-to-back releases of two underwhelming new melees, the Sun on a Stick and the Fan-O-War. Released on February 3rd, the Sun on a Stick had the same gimmick that it does today, dealing more damage against burning enemies and less damage to everyone else. At first, the damage bonus wasn't in the form of a mini crit or crit boost, it was a flat 35% increase. Every swing on a burning player would deal 47 damage, but a crit swing dealt 142 damage. Which, when combined with Scout's faster swing speed and the higher crit rate for melees in general, allowed the Sun on a Stick to unironically dish out massive burst damage. Obviously, Scout has no way of lighting enemies on fire by himself. He'd have to rely on any pyros on his team to do that for him, meaning the Sun on a Stick was destined to be gimmicky. But wow, was it a potent gimmick. Unfortunately, the Sun on a Stick would fly too close to the sun and get nerfed into the ground just a few days later. Its damage bonus was removed and replaced with guaranteed mini-crits versus burning players, which barely made up for its new 15% damage penalty. Now, against burning players, it dealt 12 more damage than stock on a normal swing, and 15 less with a crit. Into the garbage it goes. Then, 1 month later, the Fan-O-War would be released. Wait, Fan? 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 Alright, to avoid confusion, I'll be referring to both weapons by their full names from here on out. Not that I'll be talking about the Fan-O-War very often, because this thing was extremely underwhelming. Hitting someone with the Fan-O-War would mark them for death for 10 seconds. In exchange, the Fan-O-War itself dealt 90% less damage, leading to a measly 4 damage per swing. Getting marked for death is an extremely powerful debuff. Taking mini-crits is obviously bad for anyone, but unlike Jarate, you can't remove your mark for death by any means other than changing class. To this day, the Fan-O-War is the only weapon that can inflict a mark for death onto someone else. So why was the Fan-O-War so bad? Because it was a melee for Scout. Why waste time marking someone for death when you could meat shot them and kill them right after? What really held this weapon back was the fact that you can only mark one player for death at a time. Hitting someone else transfers the mark of death to them and removes it from the first player. Had the Fan-O-War been able to mark 2 or 3 players at a time, it could have been an interesting option for support Scout. Except you'd want extra health to not get instantly obliterated. And the only way to get that was with the Special Delivery set, which forced you to use the Holy Mackerel. In the Hatless update of April, the Fan-O-War's mark for death was increased to 15 seconds, but that wasn't nearly enough to make the weapon worth using. As such, the Fan-O-War was rarely used. The Sun on a Stick was also buffed in this update, swapping its mini-crits versus burning players for full-on criticals, with its damage penalty getting bumped up to 25%. Now, every swing on a burning enemy would deal 79 damage, meaning you 2-shot like classes and medics, and 3-shot everyone else but heavy. It's still gimmicky as hell, but at least it's back to being a somewhat fun gimmick. The last change in this update was a nerf to the Mad Milk. Its heal rate was lowered from 75% of damage done to 60%. This was a necessary change, but was it enough? I'd say so. at least in your average pub. In a more organized environment where you can coordinate a push after landing Mad Milk on the enemy team, then yes, it's disproportionately powerful for how easy it is to use. It can also still give scouts a greater advantage in 1v1s, but only if they land their shots. Even then, a full damage meat shot heals 63 health, meaning most of their shots will realistically only heal around 40 or 50. Like, yes, if you're fighting a godly scout, he can heal a lot off of you, but you are gonna lose the 1v1 regardless. I don't know. I could see an argument being made for the Mad Milk still being too strong, and it undoubtedly is very strong. But personally, I think it's fine. Either way, the Mad Milk was still a great option both for support and offense. On June 17th, Scout received a change that players were initially baffled by. Occasionally, upon gibbing a scout, a white dove could be seen flying out from the explosion. Something was coming. And just 2 days later, that something would be revealed. The Uber update, featuring Meet the Medic and a long list of new weapons. In fact, this update introduced more unlocks than any other update in TF2's history. And, rather infamously, those unlocks were not very well balanced, with most either being busted or worthless. Did Scout get one of those busted unlocks? Nope. He got 2. Starting with the Soda Popper, one look at its design was all you needed to understand what it did. It was a force of nature with a Criticola strapped onto it. Like the force of nature, the Soda Popper had 2 shots in its clip that fired 50% faster than stock and reloaded both shots at once. The Soda Popper's reload, however, was 25% faster than the force of nature's. Yeah, don't ask me why one stat is compared to the scattergun and the other to the force of nature. Originally, the Soda Popper lacked the scattergun's increased ramp-up, but this would be fixed a month later. The Soda Popper also didn't have the Force of Nature's knockback, which, once its ramp-up was fixed, gave it the highest burst damage out of any of Scout's primaries. 2 back-to-back meat shots could deal 210 damage in a third of a second. You may have heard that the Soda Popper outdamages the scattergun in general, but this isn't entirely true. In terms of burst damage, yes, the Soda Popper has stock beat, but then you need to reload. The scattergun comes out on top when it'd take 3 or 5 shots to kill someone, which happens more often than you'd think. It may only take 2 full damage shots to kill 8 of the 9 classes, but not even the very best players can do that consistently versus people that aren't AFK. Still, the fact that the Soda Popper's kill power was anywhere close to stock makes what I'm about to say all the more maddening. The Soda Popper, upon its release, gave Scout guaranteed mini-crits for 8 straight seconds, which he got for free every 13 seconds. The Soda Popper, the weapon that was already as good at killing as stock, had free mini-crits 40% of the time. I'm not exaggerating. The Soda Popper's hype meter originally granted mini-crits, and you built it not by dealing damage, but by running. Every life, as soon as you left spawn, you were building your meter, and it'd be ready to go as soon as you made it to the fight. Hype would activate automatically. There was no alt-fire to decide when it happened. Not to worry though, you could store it by switching weapons right before your meter was filled. And if you switched weapons while hype was active, oh look at that. All of your weapons were mini-crit boosted. If 2 mini-crit boosted Soda Popper shots, capable of dealing 284 damage in a third of a second, somehow wasn't enough to kill someone, your mini-crit boosted pistol could easily finish them off. You didn't have to be at close range to be effective either. A mini-crit boosted Soda Popper was still powerful at mid-range, and mini-crit boosted pistol shots were lethal at any range. Giving Scout such a powerful effect for running was absolutely absurd. Complain about the Diamondback all you want, At least spies have to accomplish something to get their crits. The soda popper gave you mini crits for having WASD keys. The concept was cute. You know, it's like soda. You shake it up and eventually it explodes. As a gameplay mechanic though, it was baffling how anyone thought this was a good idea. Before we move on, I do want to note that landing back-to-back meat shots with the soda popper was harder than it sounds. With the scattergun's slow but steady fire rate, it's easy to get into a sort of rhythm. Aim, then dodge. Aim, then dodge. Still, it only took a bit of practice to get closer to the soda popper's max potential, which, might I remind you, was dealing 284 damage in 1/3 of a second, enough to 2-tap an overhealed demo. Absurd. Next up, the Winger. It sucked. 15% more damage, but only 5 shots per clip. Some thought to pair it with the soda popper, as 5 mini-crit boosted Winger shots could deal up to 175 damage, but the stock pistol was wholly superior. Last, we have the Atomizer. Just by having this bat equipped, scouts would gain the ability to triple jump. This added mobility may not sound special at first. The Force of Nature and Boston Basher had already been opening new flanks for scouts to take without much issue. But unlike those unlocks, the Atomizer's triple jump could be done at any time, simply by jumping after a double jump. The only penalty was a mere 10 health. The Atomizer had an incredibly low opportunity cost, but in terms of maneuvering around the map, it didn't completely outshine the Force of Nature or Boston Basher. Those unlocks were capable of reaching much greater heights. The Force of Nature could even be used alongside the Atomizer for an effective quadruple jump. The Boston Basher, on the other hand, was decent offensively and still built uber better than anything else in the game. The Atomizer's offenses were actually even worse than the stock bat, which, when combined with the fact that its triple jump could be done at any time, led to the Atomizer itself almost never actually being seen outside of the loadout screen. Don't let that fool you though, because in reality, the Atomizer would go on to become one of, if not the, most equipped melees for Scout. Not much of an accomplishment, I know, but in the right hands, the Atomizer was deceptively broken. It was already solid just for getting around the map, but where it really shined was during combat. In a 1v1, scouts generally want to stay grounded to keep their movement as ambiguous as possible. The 3 exceptions to this are when fighting soldiers, demomen, and heavies. Against heavies, the Atomizer's triple jump wasn't all that useful. The hard part was getting in the heavy's face in the first place. Against soldiers and demos though, scouts need to stay airborne as much as possible to avoid splash damage. Before the Atomizer, soldiers and demos already struggled against a good scout, but the matchup wasn't unwinnable. The key was to wait out the scout's double jump. Once that option was exhausted, the scout would be stuck on a predictable path until they landed, giving you the chance to line up a clean shot. Trying to land a direct rocket or pipe before the scout used their double jump was a gamble, and flat out impossible if the scout was good enough to react and double jump out of the way. So against good scouts with the Atomizer, soldiers and demos would need to wait even longer for the chance to land a direct. Even after a scout used his triple jump, he could airstrafe as he landed to mix up his movement even more. Making matters worse, you'd have no idea whether a scout could triple jump or not until he, did it, throwing off your aim and giving the scout even more time to kill you. All this for just 10 health. Granted, taking full advantage of the Atomizer mid-combat took a considerable amount of skill, but as luck would have it, 2011 was the year that the very best scout mains began to truly master the class. Last we checked in with the comp scene was 2009, back when Carnage was showing to the world how terrifying an aggressive scout could be. Carnage was skilled, no doubt, but even he had not yet mastered the class, as he played a mostly grounded game. 2011 saw the rise of Clockwork, a player that combines Carnage's aim and well-timed aggression with masterful use of double jumping to become a truly dominant force. To the 99% of players that were still nowhere near this level, the Atomizer was a great mobility tool, but not much else. To that remaining 1%, the Atomizer was a great mobility tool on top of making the best 1v1 class even better at 1v1s. It had immense hidden potential, which was fitting for a weapon that was regularly equipped but almost never actually seen. Following the Uber update, Valve would largely take a break from Scout rebalancing for the next year. The original Soda Popper and Atomizer were insane in retrospect, but at the time there were far more pressing issues. In the Maniversary update of October, the Shortstop received a massive nerf, with its reload speed being slowed down by 50%. Some sort of reload nerf was necessary, but was this going too far? Viewing the Shortstop as a standalone weapon? Yeah, this was overkill. This new Shortstop wasn't terrible. Being able to deal decent mid-range damage as Scout will always be inherently useful, but it was now Scout's worst primary by a long shot. As for the special delivery set, the Shortstop's nerf was fine actually. If anything, it made the set's health bonus actually feel warranted, since before you'd get it for using weapons that were already strong on their own. Now, the item set would box Scouts into a supportive role. The Shortstop was lacking in firepower, which couldn't be augmented by a pistol because you had to use the Mad Milk, and you couldn't do anything fancy with one of Scout's melees because you had to use the Holy Mackerel. It was a bit bland and maybe a little underpowered, but the special delivery set was a legitimate subclass for Scout, which, again, was impressive considering how giving Scout extra health had the potential to break the class. In the Australian Christmas update of December, Scout was gifted yet another wintry melee, the Rap Assassin. The bat dealt 70% less damage, but right-clicking would launch an ornament that shattered and inflicted bleed onto anyone that it hit. This is just the Sandman. Like with the Shortstop clearly being a pistol, Valve made no attempts at hiding the fact that the Rap Assassin was the Sandman. Just like how the Sandman caused a full stun at long range, the Rap Assassin dealt guaranteed critical hits with its moonshots. Also like the Sandman, missing the bauble would leave it on the ground, allowing you to pick it back up. The Rap Assassin's damage output was unimpressive. The bauble itself dealt 15 damage, or 45 with a crit, and up to 40 damage from bleed. It was also incredibly buggy, exploding immediately in certain areas like Badwater Last. Compared to the stock bat, there was very little reason not to use the Rap Assassin. It gave Scout a moderately annoying projectile to chuck out every 15 seconds. The issue was that the Rap Assassin was completely outclassed. Why use this over the Sandman, or the Atomizer, or the Boston Basher? As such, the Rap Assassin was rarely used. Moving on to the Pyromania update of June 2012, Bonk's duration was increased from 6 seconds to 8, making it harder to punish than before. Now, if you saw a Scout using Bonk, you really had no hope of chasing him down. Not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but it was a bit silly how you just had to accept a Scout being in your back line because he drank the funny soda. This same duration buff was also given to the Criticola. Oh yeah, the Criticola exists. This thing was already on the gimmicky side before the Soda Popper came in to completely outclass it. Why give up your secondary to use the Criticola when the Soda Popper was literally the Criticola taped onto a gun? Well, worry not, because the Pyromania update also gave the Criticola a new perk to differentiate it from the Soda Popper. Consuming the Criticola would now boost your speed by 25%. Whereas Scout normally moved at 133% of the default run speed, Criticola Scouts topped out at 167%. Yes, I know that doesn't seem to add up. Percents are weird, just roll with it. Either way, this buff was huge. From the game's launch up until this very moment, a good Scout could always be kept in check by another good Scout, similar to how a sniper can keep opposing snipers in check. Scout, being the fastest class in the game, has the luxury of deciding when a fight with him starts or ends, except against other Scouts. If you ran into an opposing Scout, you couldn't run away. You had to fight him, and to beat him, you needed better aim, more health, or more shots in your clip. Now, enter the Criticola. If you bump into a Scout that you don't think you can beat, You run away. If you run into any other class, you now have even greater control. Your enemies have less time to react to an ambush, and less time to flee if you fall back for health or to reload. The only thing that kept the Criticola in check was the fact that consuming it marked you for death, so running away from a fight wasn't always an option. You'd still take massive damage at most ranges. Regardless, this was an insane buff. A Criticola Scout was now the second fastest thing in the game. That's right, the second fastest. Because, after all, if Valve was gonna do something as drastic as making Scout even faster, why stop at the Criticola? This same update also saw the reveal of a new primary for Scout, the Babyface's Blaster. Upon its release, the Babyface's Blaster was conceptually the same as today. Start out slow, but build up a meter by dealing damage to run faster. At max speed, a Babyface's Blaster Scout ran at 173% move speed, just slightly faster than with the Criticola. And, unlike the Criticola, the Babyface's Blaster speed boost was permanent. Kind of. First, you had to build the meter, which was easier said than done. The Babyface's Blaster's 30% damage penalty led to quote-unquote meat shots dealing 73 damage maximum, while its increased accuracy was a double-edged sword. If your crosshair was off by just a few pixels, you were dealing single-digit damage, if that. The meter itself only took 100 damage to fill. But again, 73 damage meat shots. You had to work for that speed boost. Especially since without any boost, you'd be running only slightly faster than Soldier. The original speed penalty was massive. At the start of every life with the Babyface's Blaster, you were among the frailest classes in the game, the third slowest in the game, and were using one of the weakest primaries in the game. Even once you built your meter, if you jumped a single time, it was all gone. Note, I didn't say double jump, I said jumped. You deleted whatever boost you had every time you pressed the spacebar. The idea behind the weapon was clear. The Babyface's Blaster traded all of Scout's air mobility for more ground mobility. And was it worth it? Was it worth starting every life as the statistically worst class in the game? Was it worth getting hard countered by every railing littered throughout every map? Honestly, yeah. The Babyface's Blaster was gimmicky as all hell. But that's what made it so fun to use. Building your meter was a pain, but not impossible, and playing Scout with full boost was a rush. It honestly feels too fast at first. You need some practice just getting used to it. Even the no jumping thing kinda worked in the weapon's favor. People love self-imposed challenges like that. So the Babyface's Blaster was fun. But was it good? Well, in terms of dealing damage, it was garbage. The accuracy increase combined with the damage penalty led to most Babyface's Blaster Scouts either chipping enemies for 30 damage or whiffing entirely. But that wasn't such a big deal when everyone else was whiffing all of their shots against you. A full boost Babyface's Blaster Scout was fast. Really fast. So fast that it felt like they were somehow breaking the game. Yeah, more on that later. All in all, the Babyface's Blaster was decently lethal in the right hands by virtue of how insane its speed boost was. There was really only one thing it needed to be on par with the Scattergun. A way to avoid fall damage. Yes, thank you, Valve. The Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol, released in the same update, was clearly designed to be paired with the Babyface's Blaster. Its perk of never taking fall damage could be replicated by pressing the spacebar before landing. So naturally, it'd only be useful with a weapon that punished you for jumping at all. With the Babyface's Blaster, this was moderately useful, letting you access certain flanks that would otherwise cause massive damage without a double jump. In exchange, the Pocket Pistol had a 25% slower firing speed and a 50% fire vulnerability at all times. That second downside gave Babyface's Blaster Scouts an interesting dynamic against Pyros. At no boost, they'd get outsped and instantly melted, while at full boost, they'd easily stay out of the flamethrower's range. If, for whatever reason, you used the Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol without the Babyface's Blaster, you could hypothetically avoid this downside entirely by being able to outrange a Pyro at all times. but gaining immunity to fall damage wasn't worth the hassle. However, the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol offered one more perk. In addition to not taking fall damage, scouts using this pistol were given plus 15 max health. That's like for an item set, right? As in, you'd be needing to use the Babyface's blaster to get that extra health? Oh dear god. Equipping the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol brought Scout up from 125 health to 140, capping out at 210 with overheal. Now, Scouts would never be one-shot by the direct hit unless they were at the closest possible range, which they could choose not to be at. Ergo, Scouts would never be one-shot by the direct hit. Scouts could completely negate the Sandman's only downside. They could use the Atomizer's triple jump and still have 5 more health than usual. And in general, 15 extra health on Scout was much more impactful than it sounds, at least for those that were good with the class. It may not change many on-paper damage thresholds outside of the direct hit, but if you're a good Scout, you're usually not getting hit for max damage. 15 more health as Scout means more opportunities to escape from fights you otherwise would have died from, in addition to making it harder for your enemy to force you into running away in the first place. Contrast this with the 50 extra health from the Delocus bar on Heavy. Even if it lets you survive one fight, you're just gonna die immediately to the next guy. Now, I'm not gonna pretend that the fire vulnerability was a non-issue. Sometimes you'd turn a corner at the wrong time, run into a pyro, and die. Even if you killed him before he killed you, you were put on a strict timer, with Afterburn dealing 9 damage a second. But unlike the explosive vulnerability of the Candy Cane, which pressured scouts to stay out of the point-blank range that they'd otherwise prefer to be in, this fire vulnerability didn't change much about the pyro matchup. Staying out of the flamethrower's range and weapon heckling was already the best way to fight a pyro, and the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol, as a pistol, was serviceable. It only took half a second longer than stock to unload its clip, and equally as long to reload. To a skilled player, the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol was a straight upgrade the vast majority of the time, and a literal straight upgrade in any game where the enemy team didn't have a pyro. A scout with 140 health was just wrong. The hits just keep coming though, because a little over a month later, Valve would release yet another busted secondary, the Flying Guillotine. This was a projectile that, upon hitting an enemy, would chunk them for 50 damage and dealt up to 40 additional damage with bleed. Any long-range hits, defined as having over 1 second of travel time, dealt mini-crits, resulting in well over 100 damage. This was essentially the Rap Assassin, but actually threatening. Speaking of, the bleeds of both weapons stacked with each other, making for an irritating mid to long range combination known nowadays as Bleed Scout. This combo was especially appreciated by Babyface's blaster enthusiasts, who could reliably build their meter from any range without putting themselves in danger. Now, the Rap Assassin, despite being horribly outclassed, was still superior to the stock bat for giving Scout a long-range spam option essentially for free. With the Flying Guillotine, giving up the pistol was a tough pill to swallow. Its recharge time was a mere 6 seconds, making it potentially very spammable, but I've never found this to be an issue. On its own, the Flying Guillotine was solid, if a little underwhelming. But then we get to the final perk of the original Flying Guillotine. Hitting a stunned player would be a guaranteed critical hit. The stunned status could be inflicted in a few different ways, such as the Natasha slowdown and Pyro's air blast, which opened the door for gimmicky but fun team strats. But this was very clearly meant to be paired with the Sandman as a 1-2 combo. If you hit a stunned player with the Flying Guillotine, it would immediately deal 150 damage. When combined with the Sandman Ball and the Guillotine's Bleed, this combo could deal over 200 damage. If the Sandman wasn't overpowered already, now it was. Before, hitting a Sandman Ball at medium range only gave you enough time to get one meat shot in, which A, wouldn't one-shot anyone from full health, and B, meant you'd be right in the enemy's face once the stun wore off. With the Flying Guillotine though, they kinda just died. There was nothing they could do outside of mashing WASD and hoping that the scout missed. The combo wasn't free. It actually took a great deal of skill to pull off reliably. The issue was how if you missed, you didn't put yourself in position to get punished for it. Boy, I'm getting deja vu here. It was lame to fight against. It was lame seeing a Sandman Guillotine Scout aiming for you, knowing you had no choice but to hope that he missed. And if he did, he'd run away scot-free and try again later. If nothing else, this combo was broken for how it further ruined the Scout-heavy matchup. It was more difficult not to land both shots against a heavy. The Sandman Guillotine combo was lame. It was total BS. It was also one of the most dopamine-inducing things in the entire game. More than market gardening, more than trick stabbing, this combo was addictingly fun. The initial stun building suspense as you lined up your guillotine, the immaculate sound design alongside that -150 as their ragdoll got launched across the map. Now, I'm not made of stone. I'll admit that the Sandman on its own was fun for the schadenfreude that it induced, but the satisfaction from landing this combo went far beyond that. It did take skill to pull off, and there was nothing else quite like it in the game. Following the release of the guillotine, Scout wouldn't receive any notable changes for an entire year. During that time, Scout players continued to hone their skills. Even those that had joined back in the Uber update when TF2 went free to play now had nearly 2 years of experience under their belts. This was also around the time that the player base as a whole started wising up to how absurd some of Scout's unlocks were. Take the Soda Popper for instance. From 2011 to 2013, public opinion on the Soda Popper flipped from it being gimmicky and unreliable to overpowered and massively hated. Take a look at this GameFAQs thread from 2011, discussing the balance of the Soda Popper after its ramp-up had been fixed. Underpowered. Balanced. Underpowered. Utterly worthless. Now, here's a GameFAQs thread from 2013 with the exact same title. Overpowered. 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 Overpowered, and it should be removed from the game. Nothing about the Soda Popper had changed. All that changed was that the number of skilled scouts had reached some sort of critical mass. There were finally enough of them for even the most casual of players to realize that maybe giving Scout free mini-crits 40% of the time was a bad idea. Maybe Scout shouldn't have 140 health. Maybe Scout shouldn't be able to deal 200 damage with 0 commitment. The question was, did Valve have this same realization? Well, when they finally got back to work on Scout in July of 2013, they technically did give the class a nerf. The special delivery set's bonus of plus 25 health was removed. This was not because the set had been too strong, but because item sets as a whole had proven too difficult to balance. As compensation, some of the weapons within these sets gained new perks that were based on the old set bonuses, like the L'Etranger's Cloak Duration and the Powerjack Speed Boost. As for the special delivery set, the shortstop was given a new bonus of plus 20% healing while deployed. This was an interesting way to keep the spirit of the old item set, as using the shortstop with the Mad Milk would now restore 72% of damage. This also led to small and medium health packs healing about 10 more health. But, crucially, it did not make healing from meta beams, dispensers, or the payload any faster. With this single update, an entire subclass was removed from the game. What allowed the special delivery set to enable a more supportive playstyle was the extra health, and the reason why that wasn't an issue was because the set forced you to use the shortstop without a pistol and without any of Scout's crazy melees. This new bonus healing perk was not nearly enough to justify using the shortstop, which, might I remind you, had gotten its reload speed nerfed so harshly in part because of the item set. And as if the shortstop hadn't already been beaten down enough, it was also given a new downside, an 80% increase to all knockback taken while the shortstop was deployed. This may sound like a typical nonsensical change from Valve, but it actually makes some sense. Scout is oppressively fast, but his frailty means anyone can force a Scout out with a single clean shot. So if Valve wanted to make Scout tankier and better at range without changing this dynamic, a massive knockback increase would effectively do the same thing, allowing you to force a Scout out with just one shot. It was clever, But this new shortstop didn't make Scout tankier, at least not to a degree that would warrant such a big downside. An 80% knockback increase was also pretty jarring, since you'd often get launched into the skybox without even knowing what hit you. Theory crafters at the time speculated that the knockback increase could be used to a skilled scout's advantage, like surfing an explosive to close the gap, but the shortstop was nowhere near powerful enough to do much of note with such a tech. It sadly came out of this exchange much worse than before. The winger, which had previously been one of the most boring unlocks in the game, was given a much needed buff in the same update, with it now granting a 25% jump height bonus while deployed. This was such a perfect fit thematically that it's hard to believe the winger didn't always have this upside. The added height wasn't massive, but it was noticeable, enough to open certain routes that would otherwise be inaccessible. It also stacked with the atomizer, as in, you could have the winger out and get a boost to your triple jump. I've got nothing else to say. This was just a neat change. The last change of this update was another buff to the Criticola. Last year's buff of giving the Criticola a speed boost on par with the Babyface's blaster was insane, and the only reason why it wasn't completely broken was because you'd also be marked for death. As of this update, the Criticola would no longer mark you for death. Instead, you'd take 25% more damage while under its effects, effectively putting you at 100 health. This was an objective improvement over getting marked for death. 100 effective health might still sound like a big downside at first. After all, that's what made the candy cane so hard to use, and that was only against explosives. But the Criticola's combination of speed and power made that 100 health much easier to manage. Moving faster meant being harder to hit, and dealing mini-crits meant you could dish out lethal damage at mid-range, where you'd easily dodge projectiles and take less damage in general because of falloff. Or, if fighting a light class, you could just one-shot them and leave no chance for a counterattack. To anyone with above average skill, the Criticola ironically made you harder to kill in many situations, largely because of the speed boost that probably shouldn't have been added in the first place. Giving Scout more speed may sound redundant, but in practice, it truly did break his balance. Stock Scout is just fast enough to weave in and out of battle, but not so fast that his placement feels completely random. He's just fast enough to be hard to hit, but not impossible to hit. And if Valve wanted proof, they had to look no further than the Babyface's blaster. The piece of garbage gun that required pinpoint accuracy to deal 73 max damage was still a terror to fight when wielded by a skilled player, solely because of the speed boost. It was that good of an upside. Of course, in the hands of the average player, the Babyface's blaster was just garbage. Period. Fun as hell, but garbage. To Valve, this was dissatisfying. They were experimenters. They wanted to see if it was possible to balance a weapon with an upside as extreme as the Babyface's blaster, just as they've been doing with the Criticola, and just as they had done with the Sandman. They wanted to know, what would the Babyface's blaster look like if it was on par with the Scattergun? Well, in November of 2013, they'd get their answer. Introducing the new and improved Babyface's blaster. As insane as this may sound to anyone that plays TF2 today, the Babyface's blaster was, as of this update, absurdly overpowered. Its crippling damage penalty and annoying accuracy buff were both removed, and replaced with a simple clip size reduction down to 4, meaning the Babyface's blaster could now fill its meter with a single 105 damage meat shot. If that was it, if that was all Valve did, it would have been a solid buff to the weapon. But, of course, they didn't stop there. The speed penalty at 0 boost was changed from -35% to -10%, putting Scout at 120% speed, still noticeably faster than every other class, and a massive improvement over being slower than Demomen like before. Lastly, scouts would now only lose boost upon double jumping, and rather than their entire meters getting emptied, they'd only lose 25% of it. Each of these changes on their own were huge, but it's how they meshed together that made this new Babyface's blaster one of the most insane weapons in TF2's history. Let's start from the top. Upon spawning with the Babyface's blaster, you'd be running just slightly slower than a normal scout. How much damage did it take to offset this speed penalty? 25. It took a mere 25 damage to blitz past even other scouts. 3 pistol shots from across the map was all it took to completely bypass one of the Babyface's blaster's downsides. Which meant the weapon's other main downside, losing boost for double jumping, also took just 25 damage to fix. If you were fighting someone, you could double jump all you wanted, so long as your aim was good enough to deal at least 25 damage. Even if you missed, 75% boost was still faster than a normal scout. If you double jumped and missed again, 50% boost was still faster than a normal scout. If you double jumped and missed again, 25% boost was as fast as a normal scout. And a single meat shot was all it took to max out your boost again. To scouts with above average aim, the Babyface's blaster stats looked more like this. With the Babyface's blaster becoming so strong, all of the reasons why giving Scout more speed was a bad idea became immediately apparent. A Scout at full boost was so fast that he might as well be teleporting. You'd see a Scout on the other side of the map and think you were safe, only for him to suddenly appear behind you 1 second later. While fighting him, he was so fast that landing a clean shot was nearly impossible, more so than before now that he could freely double jump. Hitting a max boost scout was so difficult that many players at the time suspected some sort of bug to be the culprit, like Scout running so fast that his hurtbox couldn't keep up with the player model. This wasn't true. It was never true. The footage you're seeing now is from some other completely unrelated bug. The Babyface's blaster never caused any sort of desync between a Scout's model and his hurtbox. But the fact that this was such a widely held belief shows how insane the weapon was. People literally thought it was breaking the code of the game. If, by some miracle, you managed to land that one clean shot on a Babyface's blaster scout, they'd likely retreat for health, only for them to grab a far-off health pack and return 1 second later to finish you off. The mind games you could do with this thing were insane. Running out of an enemy sight only to blitz back in before they could even process what happened. There was no rhyme or reason when against an enemy Babyface's blaster scout. If he was alive, he could appear behind you at any moment, even if you just saw him on the other side of the map. The only meaningful downside this weapon had was the smaller clip size, which forced scouts to duck out of combat and reload more often. This made little difference for those fighting Babyface's blaster scouts because of those potential mind games. Was a scout running away because he had to reload, or was he just trying to trick you into letting your guard down? You couldn't always tell, and you'd have next to no time to react if the scout ran back in. For those using the Babyface's blaster, yes, only having 4 shots in your clip was significant, and prevented the weapon from being a direct upgrade to the scattergun. It was the same story we've seen several times by now, an unlock being broken on Scout, not for letting him get more kills, but for letting him get about the same number of kills for much less commitment. It didn't take long for the Babyface's blaster to become one of the most despised weapons at the time, alongside the Sandman, the Flying Guillotine, Soda Popper, Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol, Criticola. Yeah, everyone knew that Scout's unlocks had some issues. Valve, however, had still not learned their lesson, because in December of 2013, they'd give yet another buff to the Criticola. As of this update, the Criticola would only give a 10% damage vulnerability when consumed. Scouts under the Criticola's effects now had an effective 113 health, up from 100, bringing him out of one-shot range from a long list of weapons. This was insanity! The Criticola already let good scouts put out lethal damage while making themselves even harder to kill. For 8 straight seconds, you could run at Babyface's blaster speed and abuse the Soda Popper's guaranteed mini-crits, all with the consistency of the stock scattergun. It was disgustingly overpowered. Yet, it wasn't seen all that often. Not because people weren't aware of its power. In fact, the common sentiment at the time was, wow, the Criticola sure is overpowered. Good thing nobody uses it. But why not? Well, for one, it usually wasn't clear when the best time to use it was. Unlike Bonk, where you always used it around the corner from a sentry or choke. You might use the Criticola expecting to go on a massive killing spree, but only run into 1 or 2 people. The ideal scenario would be running into one enemy after another, with each of them spaced apart to let you demolish them one at a time. On Payload and Attack Defend, this would rarely happen even in the most unorganized of pubs. On King of the Hill and 5CP, however, you could reasonably expect people to be spread apart like this most of the time. And, of course, abusing the Criticola to the fullest took some skill. Not a ton, but above average aim and game sense were required. Essentially, the Criticola took Scout's volatility and cranked it up to 11. It would be worthless in some games and unstoppable in others. Bad players using the Criticola would die even faster, while good players were unstoppable. Despite its relatively low usage, the Criticola was busted. Giving free minicrits to an already volatile class was a bad idea, and the fact that Scout had not 1, but 2 unlocks for this purpose was baffling. Valve, as it turned out, felt the same way. Why hold poor Scout back by giving the same absurd upside to 2 different unlocks? Let the Criticola be the free minicrits weapon. The Soda Popper could do something else entirely. Though, what options were even left? Scout could make himself faster, stronger, bulkier. He could stun enemies. He could triple jump. He could quadruple jump. You know what? Screw it. He can fly now. The Soda Popper's minicrits were removed, and in their place, Scouts could now jump up to 6 times in a row whenever hype was active. This was a pretty jarring change considering the weapon was still a gun strapped with the Criticola, but it was necessary. Having 6 jumps was undoubtedly a downgrade from the previous minicrits. Yet, this version of the Soda Popper was still extremely powerful in the right hands, because its hype still only took 13 seconds of running to build. And now, hype itself lasted for 10 seconds, up from the previous 8. This update also gave the Soda Popper an alt fire to activate that hype, so switching weapons to store it was a thing of the past. Even if you taped down your right click to activate hype ASAP like before, you'd essentially be able to fly over 40% of the time. Equipping the Atomizer wouldn't give you a 7th jump, but each of the Soda Popper's 6 jumps were boosted by the Winger, giving Scout the most vertical mobility the class had ever had access to. Nothing stopped a hyped up Scout from getting in or running away aside from invisible walls. Like with the Atomizer, the Soda Popper was already incredible for getting around the map, but skilled Scouts were also able to abuse these extra jumps during combat. The Soda Popper's hype is an amazing kiting tool for the class that's already amazing at kiting. You know how Scout can normally destroy any heavy by getting in their face and jumping all over? The Soda Popper lets Scout potentially do that against anyone. Against soldiers and demos, the Soda Popper might as well grant full immunity to them. All of this was still an overall downgrade to the previous minicrits, which just puts into perspective how insane the original Soda Popper was. Without those minicrits, Soda Popper Scouts couldn't pose as much of a threat at mid-range as before, forcing them to adopt more of a hit-and-run playstyle. Abusing this new hype to the fullest also took much more skill than what the average player was capable of. This new Soda Popper, like the Atomizer, was a sleeper pick. It was only broken in skilled hands, and only in certain scenarios, but boy could the Soda Popper still pop off. As promised, that was an insane 3 years. Remember when the Sandman was the only widely hated scout unlock? Well, now it was even more hated when combined with the Flying Guillotine. There's also the Babyface's Blaster, the Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol, the Criticola, and even the Atomizer and new Soda Popper were busted in skilled hands. So many crazy options all at the same time, and don't forget they could be used together for some truly unholy combinations. Valve's incessant experimentation resulted in Scout being more volatile than ever before. Statistically speaking, this may seem fine. A Scout using these unlocks was stronger in the situations he was already strong in, and weaker in the situations he was already weak in. Those two things should average out in the end, right? For most players, maybe. But those with above average skill could leverage Scout's speed to push the upsides of these weapons even further, and choose not to deal with the downsides. Obviously, a Scout wouldn't have such freedom in every game, but in the types of matches that a skilled Scout already excelled in, these unlocks made him practically untouchable, which was incredibly frustrating to fight against. Though, in Valve's defense, any good Scout was annoying to fight against. That was the point of the class. Were these unlocks really in need of being changed, or was this just a skill issue? The answer may seem obvious in retrospect, but at the time, it was a valid question. They've still got a few good years of development ahead of them though, so let's see if Valve can figure out how to properly balance each and every one of these unlocks. "2014 was yet another slow year for Scout changes. Aside from the shortstop's knockback penalty getting reduced to 40% in February, all Scout received in 2014 was his final new unlock, the Backscatter. This was a scattergun that did as the name suggested. Shooting someone from behind at close range dealt guaranteed mini-crits. Oh god, they just nerfed the Soda Popper, and Valve makes another gun with built-in mini-crits? Well, unlike the original Soda Popper, the Backscatter had actual downsides, a reduced clip size of 4, and every shot would be 20% less accurate. There not being any damage penalty meant the Backscatter could one-shot like classes, but only from behind. It made Scout a bit better at ambushing lone enemies at the cost of making him worse everywhere else. The reduced accuracy ensured that even the most skilled players would be sacrificing something when bringing the Backscatter to any fight. Was it worth the hassle? Not really, but that doesn't matter. The Backscatter is fun as a sort of self-imposed challenge. To make the most of its soul upside, you have to play as if you were a spy. Like father, like son, I suppose. Slip behind enemy lines and wait for unsuspecting enemies to pass by for a potential one-shot from behind. Even if I know the scattergun is superior overall, my lizard brain likes seeing those mini-crits as a reward for managing to sneak behind someone. The Backscatter was and still is pretty underwhelming, but fun nonetheless. With that out of the way, we arrive at 2015. There are only a few major updates past this point, with each being chock full of balance changes. Valve has had more than enough time to observe the growing hatred for many of Scout's unlocks, so let's see what changes they came up with. Starting with the Gunmetal update of July, both the Babyface's Blaster and the Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol were slammed with heavy nerfs. The Babyface's Blaster's boost loss upon double jumping was increased to 75%, and now every point of damage you took wiped 4% of your boost, meaning it only took 25 damage for someone to delete your boost entirely. 25 damage. A single pellet from one shotgun shot was enough to remove up to 36% of your boost. My god, they just went and killed the weapon outright, didn't they? Not being able to double jump as freely as before was manageable, but losing all of your boost for taking 25 damage felt crippling to those who had been used to using the weapon without this penalty. It was a massive nerf, but it had to be this way. We've already seen what a fully realized Babyface's Blaster looks like. No amount of tweaking would put the Babyface's Blaster on par with stock without also making everyone's blood boil when fighting it. It was the same lesson Valve had learned with the Sandman. Some weapon concepts are just inherently flawed. So the Babyface's blaster was back to being a gimmick. But was it at least a fun gimmick? I'd say so, yeah. What saves the Babyface's blaster is that although a light breeze can make you lose your boost, it still only takes a single meat shot to get it all back. It still only takes a few pistol shots to run faster than a normal scout. You still have the Flying Guillotine and Rap Assassin as extra ways to build your boost. And above all else, running and shooting at max boost is still fun as hell. Losing boost from taking damage, along with the lower clip size, makes a Babyface's blaster scout even worse against groups than usual. But on small servers or wide open maps where everyone's spread out, the Babyface's blaster is still potent. Enemies can slow you down now, sure, but you can get that speed back by killing them. It's more situational and much more punishing than before, but the Babyface's blaster is not as bad as most people think. It's alright, and we're better off keeping it as just alright. The Pretty Boy's pocket pistol was stripped of its max health bonus, which was replaced with a new perk of gaining up to 3 health for every hit. 140 health scouts had been running loose for 3 years by this point. Like with the Babyface's blaster, a pistol that boosted scouts' max health was another inherently flawed idea, and Valve was right to change it. The new healing that the pocket pistol provided was pitiful. So much so that the immunity to fall damage was suddenly the main reason to use this thing, which now only applied while the pocket pistol was active. Its fire vulnerability was also swapped for a 20% vulnerability to all types of damage while active. This made the pocket pistol much worse for what Scout's pistol is supposed to do, finish enemies on low health off. Now, taking the pocket pistol out just made it easier for your enemy to kill you first. There was no reason to use this thing. The Pretty Boy's pocket pistol was unceremoniously killed off. As for buffs, Gunmetal didn't have much for Scout. The shortstop was finally changed to have its own ammo reserve, rather than sharing it with any pistol that was equipped. This was more of a bug fix than a buff, but being able to pair the shortstop with a pistol without constantly running out of ammo was a notable improvement. The Fan O' War saw its damage penalty go from -90% to -75%, and it gained a new upside, dealing crits whenever it'd normally mini-crit. After marking someone for death, the Fan O' War now dealt guaranteed critical hits, which dealt 26 damage each, less than the stock Bat's non-crit swing. This changed nothing, and it has to be wondered what Valve was expecting to come of this. Tough Break dropped a few months later in December, and unlike most other classes, Scout received nothing but buffs. The Rap Assassin was changed to be 42% more festive. Yes, that's a real patch note, which meant that its bauble would now shatter upon any impact. Only direct hits inflicted bleed, but anyone caught in the tiny blast radius would now take up to a whopping 4 damage. This was actually a nerf overall, because now you couldn't pick the bauble back up if you missed. Its recharge rate was increased by 25%, and the damage penalty of the bat itself was lowered from -70% to -65%, leading to it dealing 1 more damage than before. Like with the Fan O' War, what was the plan here? The Pretty Boy's pocket pistol's health restored on hit was increased from a maximum of 3 health to 5. This, yet again, changed nothing. Mad Milk also got a buff, with it now having a 20% faster cooldown when used to extinguish teammates. Okay, that was actually a pretty good change. Meet Your Match came in July of the following year, with even more buffs for Scout. The Sun on a Stick was given a 25% fire resistance when deployed. Wow, daring today, aren't we? So many toothless buffs in such a short span of time, and I haven't even gotten to the most infamous one of them all. Meet Your Match was also the update that gave the shortstop its laughably useless shove. This weapon has struggled to stand out ever since the removal of the special delivery set back in 2013. It's supposed to be the primary for a more supportive Scout, but the bonus healing that was added after the item set's removal hardly made any impact. Come Meet Your Match, Valve tried a different approach. The bonus healing was removed in favor of the alt-fire shove that we know today, as well as reducing the knockback vulnerability even further, down to just 20%. This change baffled players at the time. What was the point of this? Many have theorized that the shortstop shove is to keep people at mid-range when fighting them. But that doesn't make much sense. You need to be right next to someone to push them. So why wouldn't you just shoot them and kill them? The shove itself is so cumbersome too. Like, why is there such a long delay between right-clicking and the push actually coming out? Why can't I shove while I'm reloading, aka half of my time using the shortstop? And the knockback is pathetic. You have time to maybe line up a single shot before they land. No, I don't think the shortstop shove was meant to be used as an offensive tool. Remember, this weapon was all that remained of Valve's attempts at making Support Scout a legitimate playstyle. I think the shortstop shove was meant to be used like Air Blast, other than reflecting projectiles obviously. Stalling Ubers, pushing enemies into your team's sentry, stuff like that. This was an interesting idea that could have been useful, but the shortstop shove lacks the range, knockback, and ease of use that makes Air Blast such a strong support tool. It's a shame too, because Valve actually put some effort into this random change. They made a new first-person animation and even recorded new voice lines. But in the end, it was yet another buff that changed nothing. The shortstop would remain underpowered and underused. Meet Your Match had one more buff for Scout, and this one was actually huge. As of this update, medics healing scouts would now copy their run speed regardless of which medigun they were using. Previously, this had been a unique perk for the quick fix, but not anymore. With this change, Scout went from one of the worst Uber recipients to one of the best. You can't run away from a Scout, and when he's Ubered, you can't kill him either. An Ubered Scout may still be worthless against sentry nests, but in most other situations, he can rack up kills like no one else. Medics now have a huge incentive to heal scouts, meaning those scouts are actually getting overhealed, something that rarely happened in unorganized pubs before Meet Your Match. And an overhealed scout is one of the most terrifying things to fight in the game. Scout was just made even stronger, but it was only really noticeable when a skilled scout was playing alongside a good medic that knew to pocket him in a match that didn't have sentry nests or choke points. This wasn't a common sight in pubs, so to the majority of the player base, the medic speed buff was a fine change. To those that played sixes, however, this single change had massive implications. By Meet Your Match, it had been 5 years since the rise of Clockwork inspired others to adopt his aggressive playstyle. During that time, the comp scene was completely unaffected by the insane unlocks and buffs that Scout received. Leagues simply banned those weapons, just like they had done with the Sandman. Yet, slowly but surely, Scout had become an increasingly dominant force. Scout players were improving, as were everyone else, but what gave Scouts the edge was that they could not only improve their aim, but their dodging too. Their reaction times got faster and faster, making it harder and harder for the explosive classes to land a single hit on them. Meanwhile, those explosive classes couldn't get any better at dodging Scout. They could spam AD all they wanted, but you can't dodge hit scan. Then, in late 2014, Stickies had their blast radius nerfed, giving Scouts a bit more leeway and making it harder to spam them out. By 2016, sixes had already been shifting towards Scout dominance. Meet Your Match's medic speed buff forced the meta to its logical conclusion. Scouts are now the single most dominant force in sixes, without question. For years following Meet Your Match, this change was widely considered to be a negative one. Pocket soldiers were a thing of the past. Now, both soldiers typically run the gunboats to keep up with their team's pocket scout. That scout would be entering fights with 185 health without needing to slow down for their medic, minimizing the thought that was previously required for picking fights. Medics would also be harder to punish for being out of position, leading to more stalemates and slowing the game down. Those were the arguments at the time at least. But in more recent years, opinions on this change have shifted. Medics being able to run at scout speed may cause stalemates, but it can also enable riskier plays. Or maybe it actually prevents stalemates altogether by not making medics feel like they have to stay 100 feet back during any disadvantage. In the fall of 2020, TF2L tested a plugin that reverted Medic's speed buff for their 37th season of Sixes. By the end of the season, over 70% of players voted to remove the plugin and bring the speed buff back. So was this change actually good for competitive overall, or had players just gotten used to it? I'm not at all qualified to answer that, but for better or worse, Meet Your Match made Scout the definitive king of Community 6v6. I need to specify Community 6s now, because Meet Your Match also introduced Valve's very own 6v6 format. It was a disaster, more on that in this video I made last year. But throughout the beta testing for Valve's competitive matchmaking, Scout was an absolute terror because there were no weapon bans. Of Scout's remaining crazy unlocks, the one that received the most ire was the Criticola. Scouts using this thing in Valve comp could easily go on a rampage without sentry nests, choke points, or large groups to keep them in check. People complained, and Valve listened, because come Meet Your Match, the Criticola was given its first ever nerf. Once the Criticola's effect wore off, it would now mark you for death for 2 seconds. In the types of games where people complained about the Criticola the most, games with low populations or wide open maps, this nerf didn't change much. It made it riskier for Scouts to stay in a fight when the effect was about to end, but all that Scout had to do is run behind a corner for 2 seconds and come back to finish off anyone that was still standing. This was undoubtedly a nerf, but one that skilled players could easily downplay. The last change to Scout in Meet Your Match was to the Soda Popper. Its hype meter would now be filled by dealing damage rather than running, requiring 350 damage in total. This was a sizable nerf, as now, Scouts wouldn't be given free hype at the start of every life just by running out of spawn. Even the most skilled players wouldn't be consistently dealing that much damage every 13 seconds or less, meaning the days of being able to fly 40% of the time were over. Don't be fooled though. The Soda Popper is still a powerful weapon because of how potent hype can be in the right hands. It is extremely slept on, and I think more Scouts need to experiment with how much they can get away with when they have 6 jumps. With this change, the Soda Popper has finally reached the end of its character arc, going from a brainless weapon to one with a ridiculously high skill ceiling. It's June 20th, 2017. You're a Scout main, about to start another day of fragging, when you notice a new blog post on the TF2 website. The title was simple: Balance Changes. Your heart sinks. You're still grieving from the loss of the babyface's blaster. But, like your therapist suggested, you try looking on the bright side. Valve's also been buffing Scout's worst unlocks in these past few major updates. Sure, none of those buffs went anywhere, but maybe this time would be different. You skip straight ahead to the changes for Scout, take a deep breath, and start reading. The Sandman was getting nerfed. The Criticola was getting nerfed. The Atomizer was getting nerfed. Bonk was getting nerfed. The Flying Guillotine was getting nerfed. Now, perhaps this is a bit overdramatic. Sure, that was a lot of nerfs all at once. 5 to be exact. And yes, Valve has been known to rarely, occasionally, overcorrect and nerf weapons into the ground. Scout mains were not worried about their class losing viability. All they really needed was stock. What they feared was stock becoming the only option worth using. Was this fear justified? There's only one way to find out for sure. Jungle Inferno, TF2's final major update, dropped in October of 2017. And, sure enough, those same 5 Scout unlocks were on the chopping block. Starting with the Atomizer, its triple jump now required the bat to be deployed first. Had this been all, it might have still been effective to whip the Atomizer out mid-combat. But for good measure, Valve made it deploy 50% slower. The message was clear: You will not use the triple jump while fighting someone. And yeah, being able to triple jump whenever for a mere 10 health was insane in hindsight. So the atomizer is now of no use offensively. But how about for getting around the map? Well, the winger can no longer stack with the atomizer to make its triple jump even higher. Quadruple jumping with the force of nature is still possible, but the timing is tight. Regardless, the atomizer is still a fine choice because it gives Scout more mobility for no real downside. There isn't even any self-damage to worry about because that was removed. This was perfect. No notes. This was all that needed to be done with the atomizer. So tell me, what the hell is this? Valve, fearful that they'd just nerfed the atomizer into the ground, tried to compensate by making it better as an actual weapon. Its swing speed penalty was removed. It was given a new upside of always mini-critting while airborne, and its damage penalty went from minus 20% to minus 15%, leading to an increase of 2 base damage. This was incredibly tone-deaf, which didn't bode well for the remaining 4 nerfs. But thankfully, the atomizer made it out of Jungle Inferno with a useful niche intact. Next up was Bonk. This unlock had one job: give Scout something to do at a choke point. And while it did that job well, it had always been a bit brainless ever since the post-effect speed penalty was removed way back in 2010. Jungle Inferno added that speed penalty back, with its severity now dependent on how much damage was taken. Some sort of penalty like this just makes sense. It gives enemies a reason to chase Bonk Scouts down and not let them insert themselves into the back line for free. Why did they even remove the original speed penalty in the first place? Oh, right. Strafing to bypass the Bonk speed penalty worked in 2010. It still worked come Jungle Inferno, and it still works to this very day. Why has Valve never fixed this? Well, they tried to in the Blue Moon update a few months later, but they were quickly reminded of why they shouldn't tamper with TF2 spaghetti code any more than necessary. Besides, it's not as if knowing to strafe makes Bonk's speed penalty a non-issue. You have to awkwardly shuffle in an approximately straight line to maintain your speed, making it hard to fight back if someone chases you. To Valve, that was good enough. The Criticola, after years of buffs, was stripped back down to its core. Its speed bonus was completely removed, and its 10% damage penalty was reverted back to the mark for death it had had at its release, only this time with a twist. Consuming the Criticola doesn't immediately mark you for death. It's only once you attack that the debuff is applied for 5 seconds. Every attack while under the Criticola's effects resets that 5-second timer, which can persist even after the Criticola wears off. So the 2-second mark for death added in Meet Your Match was removed. It's funny, after all of the changes made to the Criticola, it ended up being very similar to how it started out. The main difference between today's Criticola and the original version, aside from lasting 2 seconds longer, is that you can now choose when to mark yourself for death. This means you're free to roam the map without risk of dying to random shots. And once you spot someone you want to fight, you get 1 free mini-crit boosted shot before you start taking more damage. It makes using the Criticola slightly more forgiving, but not by much. The Criticola is still an incredibly volatile weapon on an already volatile class. When fighting a Criticola Scout, you either delete him instantly or get obliterated. It's devoid of any depth or nuance, which is why even today, the Criticola is unpopular both to use and fight against. Today's Criticola is probably the most balanced you can get with the concept of giving Scout free mini-crits. But perhaps Valve would have been better off scrapping the idea entirely, rather than spending so much time tweaking an unlock that was destined to always be hated. Much like the next unlock, the Sandman. Valve had gone through the same song and dance with this thing back in 2009. They'd spent months nerfing, then buffing, then nerfing, then buffing the Sandman in hopes that they could make a weapon that stuns players without it being widely hated. That hope never came to fruition, and eventually they gave up and left the Sandman in a state similar to the modern-day Criticola. Not overpowered, just really lame. That was back in 2010. 7 years later, the feedback Valve was getting on the Sandman was largely the same. People still hated losing the ability to fight back. So, come Jungle Inferno, Valve swallowed their pride and did the unthinkable. The Sandman stun, after being in the game for 8 whole years, was removed. For better or for worse, the Sandman and its stun had become iconic parts of TF2. It was sad seeing it go, and part of me does miss it, but I think the game is better off this way. The Sandman stun was fun and silly, but it could also be used in lame and degenerate ways, in a game that already has no shortage of lame and degenerate options. In contrast, you don't see people seriously call for the Holiday Punch to be nerfed, which is effectively a stun, because it's tied to a melee on heavy. There's no room for exploitation, it's a purely fun and silly weapon. The Sandman stun was gone, but what mechanic would take its place? In an attempt to keep the spirit of the original Sandman alive, it would still slow enemies down like before, only without disarming them. That sounds pretty underwhelming, I know, but don't worry. Valve had some big buffs to compensate. Max range moonshots would now register at a 20% shorter distance, and your reward for hitting such a shot was a 50% increase to the ball's damage, dealing a staggering 23 hit points. God damn it, why does Valve think letting Scout's melees do slightly more damage makes any difference? They also lowered the cooldown to 10 seconds, but that doesn't matter when the potential reward for using the Sandman is so low, and the cost of its health penalty is so high. Valve took one of TF2's most iconic weapons and killed it. Whether you loved the Sandman or hated it, this fact rubbed everyone the wrong way. What bothers me the most is that the Sandman slowing people down isn't a terrible idea. This could have been a neat supportive weapon had Valve made this change years ago and given themselves time to tweak it. One idea I had was for the Sandman's ball to instantly recharge if you hit someone, with the logic being it bounced off of them and back into your hand. Then you could run around slowing multiple people down one after another. It would probably still suck, but at least it'd be fun. I'd certainly use it. Valve, however, had no such plans. Did the Sandman deserve a nerf? I'd say so, but no one wanted a nerf as harsh as this one. The Sandman was now garbage. And then they nerfed it a second time.
He's already dead! He's already dead!
Not only did the Sandman lose its stun, it also lost its combo with the Flying Guillotine, which would no longer deal any guaranteed crits on stunned enemies, or mini-crits at long range. The Sandman Guillotine combo needed some scaling back. Letting Scout deal over 200 damage without ever putting himself at risk was dumb. But removing the combo entirely? Now this pissed a lot of people off. People that had loved pulling that combo off simply because it was fun. There was nothing else like it in the game, and now there's nothing like it anymore. So what was the point of the Flying Guillotine now? Mindlessly spamming it, I guess. That's what it was used for when it wasn't being paired with the Sandman, and that's what Valve leaned into here. Any Flying Guillotine hit that had traveled for more than half a second would now lower the recharge time by 1.5 seconds. All it is now is a moderately annoying long-range spam weapon. It's not overpowered, it's not underpowered, it's fine. But without that combo, it is painfully bland. In total, 5 weapons, 25% of Scout's unlocks, had been nerfed all at once. Many, if not all of these weapons were deserving of some nerfs, but these changes failed to compensate by adding any new options in return. No, the atomizer becoming a discount market gardener doesn't count. However, it's always darkest before dawn. Jungle Inferno had one massive glow up in store for one of Scout's least equipped unlocks, the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol. Surprisingly, being immune to fall damage was not high on the priority list for most Scouts. That old perk was removed, allowing Valve to focus on the heal on hit idea that they'd given the weapon 2 years prior. Its firing speed penalty was swapped for a 15% firing speed bonus. Its max health on hit was increased even further to 7. Its damage vulnerability was removed, and now its only downside would be a 25% smaller clip size. The increased health gain, along with the faster firing speed, allowed the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol to heal a surprising amount at close range, and medium range, and long range. Huh. There was a bug that caused every hit from the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol to heal the max of 7 health, and although that would be fixed come December, the pocket pistol was still an extremely powerful package. It not only healed you, but also dealt damage on par with the stock pistol. That healing wasn't insignificant either. It was often enough to bring a low health scout out of range from random chip shots and stray bullets, forcing enemies to land a second clean shot. In the hands of players that could consistently land their pistol shots, the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol was broken. This was the one scout unlock Valve had meaningfully buffed in years, and they still messed it up. By the Blue Moon update of March 2018, it would be nerfed. Its max health on hit was dropped down to 3, which, ironically, was what it had been back in Gunmetal. Now, the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol is fine. The healing is back to being pitiful. If you were to hit every shot of your clip at close range, you'd only get back 27 health. That's the best case scenario. Realistically, you'll be getting 10 health or less per clip. The faster firing speed means that it does technically outdamage stock for the first 9 shots, but that fact is highly overrated. Is the pocket pistol still a direct upgrade to stock? Probably, but its upsides are so minuscule that it's hard to even tell. This was the last balance change made to Scout. Yet another unlock getting nerfed because Valve underestimated how powerful it'd be in skilled hands. It's poetic, really. An unfortunate but fitting end to this story. Scout was finally left without any truly overpowered weapons. Sure, some unlocks might still be a bit too strong in some situations, but they don't come close to the likes of the original Soda Popper, or the original Sandman, or the buffed Babyface's Blaster, or the many other crazy unlocks Scout has had over the years. It was back to basics. But in an act of solidarity, Scout mains across the world came together on March 28th, the day that Blue Moon dropped, to break the game with their favorite class one last time. A final chance to relive the glory days. They threw their Mad Milk to the ground, symbolizing their rejection of Valve's many nerfs, and took to the skies. Bird Scout was a phenomenon that quickly swept across the entire player base. By throwing Mad Milk with the atomizer equipped, dying, then picking the Mad Milk up while still holding down left click, Scout would enter an A pose that had infinite jumps. The ease in which this glitch was done, combined with the community's love for A posing in general, led to every single match having flocks of Bird Scouts making their great migration across the Badlands. For all you bird watchers out there, you can identify a Bird Scout by listening for its distinct chirps. This glitch came about as a result of a bug fix for the atomizer, preventing scouts from triple jumping by taking the atomizer out before it was fully deployed. It's weird that the winger still gets its bonus jump height instantly, but don't tell Valve that. Bird Scout would be fixed just one day later, but its legacy will never be forgotten. Past Blue Moon, there's one final thing worth mentioning. An underdog story that's unfolded over the past few years. By doing absolutely nothing, the rap assassin of all things has seen a massive spike in popularity. This isn't because people have suddenly realized it's a straight upgrade to the stock bat. That had been well known ever since the weapon's release back in 2011. But with Jungle Inferno nerfing both the Sandman and the Atomizer, the competition was made low enough for the Rap Assassin to actually be worth using. Then, in December of 2021, the bugs that had caused the Rap Assassin's bauble to instantly explode in certain areas were fixed. Today, the Rap Assassin is among Scout's most used melees, teaching us all a valuable lesson. Sometimes, it's best to fly under the radar. And after over 16 years of new unlocks and balance changes, this is the state that Scout remains in today. So, how has Scout evolved since TF2's release? From the day TF2 launched, Scout had already been perfected. He was balanced around the volatility that you'd expect from a glass cannon, being fast and powerful, but not to an overwhelming degree. The only design flaw you could point to was his utter uselessness in some situations, which the introduction and eventual buffing of Bonk patched up nicely. With such a strong foundation in place, Valve had the opportunity to experiment with whatever wild ideas they could think of. And experiment they did, with the original Sandman still being widely considered to be the single most overpowered weapon of all time. There was the original Soda Popper, with its free mini-crits every 13 seconds, and the Atomizer giving Scouts effective immunity against explosive classes. There was the Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol, giving Scout 140 health, the Flying Guillotine and its insta-kill combo, the buffed Babyface's Blaster and Criticola, making Scouts unstoppable with their speed boosts. Then came the nerfs. Mostly justified nerfs, mind you. So many of Scout's unlocks had concepts that were flat out impossible to balance without also pissing people off. Weapons causing a little frustration is tolerable, but Scout's best unlocks at their peaks were on a whole other level. Imagine dying to a guillotine crit because you pressed D when you should have pressed A, or being physically unable to touch a Babyface's Blaster, Criticola, or Atomizer Scout, or dying to a Scout and seeing that he'd only survived because of the Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol, or to a Soda Popper Scout because he was storing his free mini-crits until he ran into an enemy that happened to be you. The issue with all of these weapons getting nerfed in such a relatively short time was that Scout was given next to nothing in return to compensate, making the last few years of TF2's active development feel like a regression for the class. The loss of the Sandman Guillotine combo stung, as did the removal of the Special Delivery set. I get why item sets were removed, but it sucks that Valve could never figure out how to make Support Scout work beyond equip the Mad Milk and throw it sometimes. However, if there's one thing you've learned from this video, it's that when you give Scout an inch, he takes a mile. We've seen time and time again how Scout's mobility enabled players to push seemingly mediocre or downright terrible weapons to terrifying heights. Many of Scout's unlocks still have that untapped potential, even to this very day. The Soda Popper's skill ceiling is practically infinite, while the Force of Nature's self-knockback allows for tricky mid-combat movement not unlike the original Atomizer. The Babyface's Blaster is absolutely still good in the right environment. I will die on that hill. And the Criticola. Marking yourself for death is a pain, but if you paired it with a pocket medic, isn't that basically a mini Flog Uber on Scout? I think Bonk is super underrated too. Like, why aren't more people using it to spawn camp for free? Not that I do that, of course. The point is, Scout's unlocks are still potent, because Scout is an inherently potent class. They may not be game-breakingly overpowered anymore, but it only takes a bit of creativity and skill to make them feel like they still are. As always, thanks for watching, and special thank you to my patrons.